My name's Elisa Clancy, and I'm the program director and host of A Morning Cup of Jazz at KCSM, we're the Bay Area's jazz station in San Mateo. So expand on yesterday's talk.
I will be giving that talk again tomorrow, by the way, for the people who were latecomers. And the title of it is The Truth About Ragtime, which is a somewhat semi-facetious title, because I know nothing that all the rest of you don't know, except that I, over the years, have found myself more and more jaundiced about the excessive use of labeling in our music. And not just music, but literature, art, anything having to do with culture.
Put it in a box.
Well,
everybody wants to do that.
We have to have a label, and as I say in this other talk, we are a labeling species. And that's okay, except I think it confuses our ability to enjoy. And if something doesn't fit the category we prefer, we don't listen. I once worked with a wonderful musician, a banjo player, the late Spencer Quinn, down in LA. Many of you knew Spencer. Spencer always said that nothing good had been written since 1930. 2 weeks later, I was in New York working with a jazz musician, a wonderful experience, and he said, nothing good was written before 1930. And that's where they listened, and I think that's kind of too bad, because categories are not helpful. Does that help? It
is. Do you think that we have lost our curiosity? Is that what happened? Because we used to be so much more curious.
Oh, I don't think we used to be anything. I don't think we are any better or worse.
Then we're not curious anymore.
No, come on, this is a constant. This is a constant in society. We label. We label everything. We should. We have to. We label flowers. We label insects. We label eras. And that's good, except when it comes to music and art, and for that matter, a great deal of poetry and literature, we cut ourselves off from things we should enjoy.
Getting feedback on
Why give it a label and say, well, that can't be ragtime, so I can't like it.
We get that all the time at the jazz station.
I bet you do.
All the time. What is that crap? That's not jazz.
Well, that is one of the things I point out, and it's obvious to anybody that study even minimally the history of jazz. What's jazz? I don't know. If Paul Whiteman was jazz, is Miles jazz? They don't sound the same to me.
Sure don't.
But they're both wonderful musicians who I like to listen to. My favorite pianists run all the way from Arthur Rubinstein through Hank Jones and Bill Evans and down to Thelonious
and Art Tatum and everybody else.
And we all grew up on Tatum.
Art Tatum.
And anybody that ever played the piano beyond 4 chords adored Tatum and spent about the next 2 months deciding they would give up the piano.
They couldn't do it, that's right.
Yeah, you're going to quit. But no, I'll tell you, now that we're on Tatum, and I'll bet you some of them did the same thing. In the 30s and the 40s, you could still buy manuscripts, printed folios of Waller and Tatum and Teddy Wilson. So you'd buy the Tatum folio, and you'd take T for 2 or whatever, and then he'd do these incredible arrangements. And what you would do, you'd go in and find 2 measures that you could use, improvisationally. You could not, I couldn't. I could never sit down and play Tatum. Who could? Yeah. But he'd do transpositions or he'd do modulations. The guy was always changing key. And you'd go in and you'd find...
You could rip those off.
Yeah, 3 or 4 measures. And you'd spend 2 weeks mastering them, and then they'd come under your fingers.
Yeah. Hey, growing up, let's see, you grew up in Colorado Springs, right? What was in Colorado Springs when you were a kid that got you into this stuff in, what is it, the early 30s? What's the catalyst for you, since you were the catalyst for me? What were your parents into music?
Well, yes and no. Briefly, yes, I grew up in Colorado Springs. My folks were divorced when I was 4. My mother was a schooled pianist from Iowa. She had spent a couple of years at Iowa State, and she was a really good pianist. I'll brag on my mother this way, and I've mentioned this several times in other speeches, but my mother was raised in Ottumwa, Iowa, in a family of 8, farm family. And her older brother, it was one of those families where her older brother was almost 20 years older than she was. And he was a lawyer. And he was a good piano player, but he was an ear player. He couldn't read music. But they were in Ottumwa, Iowa, not too far from St. Louis, and my Uncle Dick fell in love with ragtime, so he'd go out and buy all the latest rags. And this is around 1906, 1907, all the great years. And he'd bring home the sheet music, and my mother, Gladys Ramsel, he'd say, "Gladdy, play this for me. Read it." And then he'd sit down, you know.
And then he would play it.
Then he'd sit down and play in his key, which was G flat. And the great thing about it was that my mother then would take that sheet music and keep it in the piano bench.
There you go.
And she could read it, of course, and she could read like a bandit. So that piano bench then went with us to Colorado when she went there for another sister's health to Colorado Springs, which in those days, you know, Colorado Springs was pretty well populated by people getting overconsumption.
That's right.
As they used to call tuberculosis. So those piano rags were in our bench, and my mother didn't play them a lot, but she played enough that eventually I found my way into that piano bench, and I played a few of the rags, but I was more interested in jazz. I will say this, and I love to brag about my mother this way, and some of you who are pianists will understand this. My mother, who was a school pianist and could read, bam, bam, could not improvise.
Couldn't get off the page. Yeah.
So she goes to work at the Princess Theater in Colorado Springs, Colorado, playing for the silent movies. And of course, some of them had scores, but most of them you had to ad-lib. You had your agitato, you had your suite, you had your chase music, you had your... And so here is my mother with music. Here, oh gosh, I'm going to do grabbing this, grabbing that. She couldn't ad-lib it.
Yeah.
And so it was terribly difficult for her. Okay. Now comes the Depression. It's 1930. My mother is divorced. She has no job, and my father, who's a nice guy and never sent much money, my mother wanted to play the piano. So at the age of 37, she taught herself to improvise. Wow. That's practically impossible.
Yeah.
That's practically impossible because, and by the way, this is something I've always thought about piano instruction. Please teach our kids the circle of fifths. Please teach them how to use a 1 chord and a 4 chord and put a flat fifth on it. Please. Because they're not all going to end up on the concert stage, but they'd love to sit down and be able to improvise T for 2.
Yeah.
Okay.
And get the girls, as Duke Ellington said.
Oh, I didn't know about
That's
that.
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
That's how you get the girls.
That never happened to me.
That's what Duke said. He says, you know, the reason why I became a piano player, and, you know, he was a rent party guy. That's how they were making their money, was because they got the chicks. And, you know, drummers, of course, never get the chicks.
Well, they were busy.
It takes too long to pack up better
That's
stuff.
right.
The bass players, they're too mellow. They're too mellow, you know, that sort of thing.
Okay, are we going to do questions, or do you
No,
have more?
I want you to tell me about radio. Because
radio,
you've done a lot of radio, and I want to know how you got into
I'll do that real quickly. And here's a question.
How did you personally start?
How did I serve what?
How did you personally start?
Oh, I took piano lessons as a kid, you know. And I played, my first rag was Original Rags, which was in that piano bench. And the reason I like Original Rags is because it's easy.
It is easier.
Easy. No, it's not. It's not. The maple leaf's hard. I learned the maple leaf. It took me a couple of years, and I finally played it for my childhood sweetheart, Elizabeth Hendy, and she cried. No, she didn't cry. She left me for a football player.
What are you going to do?
Could have been a drummer.
Right, could have been a drummer, he says. Yeah.
Could have left you for a drummer.
Yeah. Well,
Or a trumpet player, for God forbid.
what you just asked me.
Radio.
Radio, yeah. Okay, look. I didn't earn my living with the piano for a long time, and frankly never really did earn my living as a pianist. I was in the broadcasting business for a long time, and I started out when I was 17 years old as a staff announcer at the only radio station in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which was a CBS affiliate, and I learned how to do, "This is KVOR, the voice of the Rockies in Colorado Springs, and now the noon news." I loved it. I was just starting in college, and I had this great job. They paid me $1 an hour.
I must have heard you because that's why I wanted to.
Well, you didn't hear me. You're too young.
I love those guys.
This is, hey, radio was so different in those days, and what isn't, you know. But a staff announcer had a great deal of responsibility, and you did everything. You went in and tore the news off the AP wire, and you read it. If you'd been there over a month, you read it cold.
Mm-hmm.
You did not pre-read. None of the pros did that. You read it cold.
Well, and you also had to make a time. You had to make the time, so to meet the network and all of that.
Absolutely.
So you have to
in those
watch
days,
the clock.
A 1 hour show was 59 minutes. A half-hour show was 29 minutes. You watched the clock. I remember once, for some reason, we had 20 seconds of dead air. The manager was in there. What's wrong?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Yeah.
You're fired.
Yeah. So I loved it. And it paid my bills for a long time. And then I got into television when it came into the West. People have forgotten, especially here in this part of California, because San Francisco got television early.
We did.
You had 3 stations.
We did.
There was, and I have looked in the reference books about the history of television, and I cannot believe that nobody even writes about the fact that for 3 years, the Federal Communications Commission froze new allocations of very high frequency of VHF channels, the 13 that we all depend on. And in their wisdom, they were trying to find out if ultra-high frequency, UHF, would work. And they built a transmitter up in the mountains north of Colorado, by coincidence, had nothing to do with Colorado. And for 3 years, 1949 to 52, there were no new television stations. Places like Denver, Albuquerque, Salt Lake City.
Was this a Paley thing? Was it like a monopoly?
Oh, no, it had nothing to do. It's purely technical.
Oh, I see.
The burgeoning audience for television and the wish for more and more outlets in each town to make money and sell. They were deciding they could no longer do that on the existing 13 channels. So they went to ultra-high frequency, which, you know, was horizon. Very much like FM. And
line of sight.
Line of sight. Well, yeah, and they worked on it for 3 years, and they finally decided in their wisdom that it was okay now to allocate UHF stations. And the fact of the matter, of course, was nobody had a set that could receive UHF. This is the same thing that happened with a different result with AM and FM.
And then with digital and HD and all of that, where you had to have the box on your TV, and then we had to transfer. It's always changing.
Yeah, and if you remember, when FM came along, and that took years of experimentation, and they finally decided it was okay to allocate FM stations, different place, different dial, and most radios did not have AM, FM capability. The reason we were going to get FM was because now, finally, we could get full-range musical recording. So now what are we listening to music in? Earbuds. We're not listening to those great, big, wonderful speakers that they said we'd all listen to. And that we'd receive our FM solely on musical stations, and it would blow us away. So I'll tell you, one of the things, and I won't get too far into it, but I did a series of lectures at a couple of universities about the ongoing influence of technology on the performing arts. And no matter where you look, in music, theater, even novels, certainly in art, technology has driven us. We have not driven technology, it drives us. And one of the opening lines I used to use in prefacing this kind of a lecture, we'd get into the history of the phonograph, the history of motion pictures, and so forth, was this, that without the invention of the vacuum tube, Bing Crosby would probably have been practicing law in Spokane. Without the invention of solid-state technology and multi-track tape, Mick Jagger would probably be teaching economics at Trinity College, which is what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And without the invention of talking pictures, Mary Pickford might not have become an alcoholic. Well, I mean, I know that's funny, but it's true. Mary Pickford didn't have the right voice. She was the biggest star in the motion picture world. And when they went to talkies, if you've seen Singing in the Rain,
Or if you've seen The Artist, which is a great film.
well, yeah,
There's
same idea.
Same idea.
In other words, those careers, my career, your career, have been shaped by the advent of degrees of technology that have come in a cascade.
Yeah.
One of the things that I will deal with, no, I did yesterday, I dealt with the fact, and I've always been fascinated by this, but in the speech that I'll repeat again tomorrow, that until we got electronic recording, orthophonic recording, 1925, all recording was acoustic.
Mm-hmm.
And the acoustic recorder, that little stylus, did not like the piano.
Or the drum.
Or the drums.
Mm-hmm.
The piano scale, and I won't go into this because that talk I'm doing tomorrow deals with this, but the original acoustical recording wanted pure tone. A cornet, fine, we hear you. A soprano, we love you. A banjo, we got you. The piano, wait a minute, it's distorting. Why? Because the piano scale is imperfect. The piano scale is doctored. The piano scale took centuries. By the way, there's a wonderful book, I should be able to tell you the author's name, about the advent of the tempered scale. And it took centuries. We give it to Bach.
Yeah.
Well-tempered cat. But it took years and years because what they were trying to do was take tonality, which exists in nature. And I don't care where you are or when, 10,000 years ago on the planet Mars, you pluck a string or you blow through a reed and you'll get a tone. And the first overtone of that tone will be an octave. And the next overtone will be a fifth. And the next overtone will be another octave. And the next overtone will be a fourth. And then you go on up through thirds and so forth. But that is in nature. And if you want to build a keyboard on which a C sharp sounds the same as a D flat, you've got to temper the scale. Because if you use the scale that exists in nature, and all string players know this, for a violinist, a D flat is not C sharp, right? There's a little difference. So they finally figured out how to temper or equalize the scale, and they figured out how to put it on a keyboard and divide it up into 13 sections. And a D flat sounds like a C sharp. And until then, this all happened, and I touch on this again. Without that, we don't get Beethoven.
That's right.
We don't get Mozart. We don't get any of the great piano works that had to be done on an equal scale. And we don't get Scott Joplin, and we don't get Fats, and we don't get any of the things that happened after that. That's technology at the root of what we have known. That's 2 centuries ago.
Yeah.
Talk about the last century. Wow. Okay.
Well, the delivery systems have changed so rapidly. The art is mimicking the delivery systems, I think. And I mean, what do you think?
Well,
I mean, the delivery system, from 78s to LPs to cassette to 8 tracks to,
Well, and that's
MP3s.
Here's the thing, and here again, I used to do this at one of my shows, and I touch on it in one of these lectures. The remarkable thing, and happily occurred a good part of it exactly in the same era that this music occurred, But 4 or 5 of the most elemental technical breakthroughs took place in the 40 or 50 years right around the turn of the century. Think about it. The telephone, the phonograph, motion pictures, flight. These things all happened within 25 years of one another, and most of them happened in the United States of America, although Europe was not far behind. Each one of those things, when they happened, and it's great to read the literature, they were miracles. They were miracles. There were articles that said about the phonograph. What if we'd have had it at Calvary? What if we'd have had it at Gettysburg? And as a matter of fact, I do a little thing about how there were entertainers for about 2 years in 1878 after the phonograph was invented. I'll do this. It's in this speech. We'd go around the country making good money in an auditorium demonstrating the tinfoil cylinder invented that year by Thomas Edison. And it was all in the big horn, you know, stylish. Hello? Hello? And this is from my speech tomorrow, but they'd bring prominent people up to the stage. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the governor of Chicago, William Irwin. I looked it up, William Irwin. The governor of California has consented to say a few words. Here's the horn. He's a big horn. This is Governor William Irwin. Mary had a little lamb.
This is your governor, Mary Irwin. Mary had a little
But then, of course, really, to answer your question, it's a matter of a few months, and we take everything for granted. Of course you've got telephones. Of course you've got recorders. Of course you can fly.
Magic is possible.
Well,
Every day.
But these were miracles.
Yeah.
And you go back and read the literature. You know, everybody said we couldn't fly. And if you look it up, by the way, the Wright brothers flew in 2003. Nobody believed it. You can look it up. Nobody really believed it until 2008, when the Wright brothers figured out how to fly their invention and went to France and did a series of long-range demonstrations, and the press said, well, I'll be damned. Who do you fly? Nobody believed it for 5 years, because we couldn't do that.
Yeah.
Man can't fly.
Great.
Long-winded answer to your question.
Yeah.
Hey, how about some questions from the folks here?
Max, I got one. How did you pitch your educational series to early public television? How did you pitch it?
I'd be glad to answer that. I didn't. A friend of mine by the name of Moss Hall, who now lives in Carmel. Here's the story, and I'll make it quick. Through the 1950s, I was working at the Imperial Hotel in the summers in the Cripple Creek Melodrama Company, playing the piano and so forth. A friend of mine, a theatrical guy named Moss Hall, was the stage manager. And then around 59, we quit doing that. I did 6 seasons up there. Moss went to work for the Denver Educational Television Station. This is 9 years prior to PBS. This is NET, National Education. Denver happened to have, along with the station you have in San Francisco, happened to have a real television station. Most early educational television was a cinder block building with one camera shooting a picture of a guy standing in front of a drape giving a lecture, which is fine. That was educational. In 1959, and they were still based in Ann Arbor, they said, well, hey, we'd like to introduce some educational elements into these programs. Submit a pilot.
Mm-hmm.
Moss Hall was working in Denver. I was still in Colorado Springs, came down, and he said, let's do something, I'll pay you.
Yeah.
So we did a half-hour pilot on kinescope film, Speaking of technology, there was no videotape. Another miracle. And we submitted it, and they bought it, and we submitted then with a budget to do, at that time, 12 one-half-hour programs.
Yeah.
Called the Ragtime Era. Only 2 of them actually had to do with ragtime music. One of them piano music and the other one with dance music. The others were about society at that time, as seen through the music. The second series we did there was even more so looking at life as seen through popular music and through theater.
So was it you just standing in front of it,
Well, no,
parade?
see, no, what they wanted and what we did, and it was great. In other words, they wanted the basic accoutrements of entertainment. A set,
Sure.
costumes if you wanted to, people joining in dialogue, bands, and so we did that, and it was very successful, partly because, and here you go. This is perfect about technology. If you remember, and I think most of the people in this room do, that up until 1960, if you saw Sid Caesar or Ed Sullivan out here, it was on what they called kinescope film, and it was pretty awful. Of course, it's all black and white, but it was broken up because the scanning rate of motion pictures and the scanning rate of a television camera are 4 frames different.
Yeah.
So that for a camera to take a picture of a television and turn it into 16 millimeter film requires a special projector or to make that difference. And it never really worked very well.
Yeah.
So we were right at the end of kinescope film, and our first series of those 12 was shot on kinescope film and sent around the country that way. But, and here's one of the greatest breaks in my own life and Moss Hall's and all of the things that happened. Right at that very time, this is late 1959, Ampex perfected their first 2-inch reel-to-reel videotape. The thing was going at 30 feet a second, half-inch tape. We got, thanks to the Ford Foundation, they gave all of the educational stations, there were 60, gave each one of them one of those sets. So we also did all of those things on videotape. We backed up the first series on kinescope film for the people that didn't have. But the thing was, one of the reasons we got such attention, and we got a lot of attention nationally, not necessarily because of Max Morath, we got it because of these great pictures that were coming down. And our engineer at that station, Scotty Cullen, was one of those mechanical geniuses, and these things were hard to run.
Yeah.
They were very hard to make a clear picture with. Scotty knew how. They flew him all over the country, fixing everybody else's videotape. And of course, you know what's happened with videotape since then. I mean, who knows where it's going now? But that made that series acceptable at a higher level of attention. Because the pictures were great. And if you look back at kinescope film today, it's awful. Well, no, you don't remember. You're too young.
Yes, I do.
Anyway, that's the answer to that question. And there again,
Yeah.
technology, including a breakthrough and the use of it.
Yeah. I want you to talk about Arthur Godfrey, because I've never heard anything about you working with Arthur, and you were like a regular guest on his show, weren't you?
Well, as he always said, I have no regulars.
Just irregulars.
No, he got so burned by his Julius LaRosa story, and I will cut to the chase very quickly, and I will tell you that Arthur Godfrey, and I worked with him for about 10 years, and we developed, I'm happy to say, a good friendship with him and with my family. He was one of the most remarkable people I have ever met, much less worked with. Arthur Godfrey had the energy of 10 people. Remember, he was badly injured in an automobile accident, and he was carrying around a lot of metal in his body. He had one lung removed when he was still selling Camel cigarettes, and he took them off the air right away. He flew his own aircraft. I can tell you that he was a close friend of General Curtis LeMay, and Arthur Godfrey was allowed to go out at that time, the F-16 solo. I've never seen a man with such energy and such diversity of interests. When I was working with him, and this was in radio, it was a CBS radio, and he still had his radio. I did a few television, but his great age of television and radio was in the late 50s. This was I worked with him from 65 to 74 when he went off the air radio-wise. And we had this wonderful band in the studio. That was when the network still had studio musicians.
Live musicians, what a concept.
Just for Hank Jones on piano.
Hank was one of the first black studio musicians.
And of course Hank Jones, to be a studio musician, you had to do everything. You went from opera to rock and roll. But anyway, we had that band, and I remember, just to give you an example, once Arthur Godfrey had us all go to Chicago. He was doing some big industrial thing, hotel there. He took the band, and he took me and a couple of other people that had worked with him and him. And we'd flown all day, and we'd rehearsed all afternoon, and we did a show at 9:30 at night, and we were in the hotel, and we said, we're going to bed. And he said, no, I got to go out and get, he flew a Gulfstream or whatever it was, twin jet. He said, no, I got to go. I'm going out to the airport. I'm doing a fair. I'm doing a fair date in Omaha tomorrow. The man was a horseman. He did dressage. And he trained horses.
I didn't know that.
He had a training barn on his estate in Leesburg, Virginia. And he had a woman who was a coach, who was full paid, with, I think, maybe 4 or 5 animals that were trained in dressage. So if he wasn't doing one thing, flying airplanes or doing radio, and by the way, one other thing I'll tell you about Arthur Godfrey, and thank you for asking. He was the first person that I ever heard use the word of the importance of ecology. He was a conservationist from the word go, and he was militant about it. And see, the thing about Godfrey is that voice. Remember, he started out as a staff announcer at WTOP.
Same sort of thing.
This is WTOP, and he did very well in Washington. And then one of the memorable things about him, and that got the national attention, is that he did the walking eulogy of the Roosevelt funeral. And he fed the network. We see the cortege go by at 1945. And he's well known in Washington, but not necessarily around the country. He's feeding CBS live and talking about it. And he was very emotional. He let it flow out. He went in, it was in tears. But he was articulate. And he got national attention. CBS suddenly decided, hey, maybe we should put this guy in the network. And let me tell you, here's another thing about radio, and I don't know whether you remember this. Network radio, up until about that time, and even through into this later, network radio was live. You did not use records. KGO or KPO. I went to Stanford.
KGO.
I went to the Stanford television.
We
did a program there when Tony Freeman was still the director of music. They had studio musicians 24 hours a day sitting there in case they needed 8 seconds of dead air filled. If you did a live radio show, there was an orchestra over there in a sound booth. They did the music. And when Godfrey went on the air, he threw away the script. And the people at the networks in New York said, you can't do that, Arthur. You have to have a script. And he said, no, I don't think so. And he broke that mold. We take it for granted now that when you open a microphone, like we could be feeding your station right now, and it'd be fine. You didn't do this. You did not do this. And at the time, the only other person, in my memory, that was allowed to go on network radio without a script and speak was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Godfrey broke that mold.
Yeah. He was the first jazz improviser on the air,
Well,
improvising. I mean,
He just talked.
Yeah.
If you wanted, and he'd run over. I'll tell you this, and he was a salty guy. What we do when you do the radio shows, you go into the studio, and you'd be in there all day. These are 1 hour shows, and you tape 3 of them.
Yeah.
So you're there and you're having lunch and so forth, and the tapes are rolling, and the orchestra takes a break, and you're having a great time, and you're doing your job. And every once in a while, something would go wrong, and Godfrey would say, well, we've got to cut that tape, take that out, take it out with a razor blade, edit the tape. And he'd always say, the reason what he would do, he said, I want to be sure they cut that out. And then he'd let loose a string of 4-letter words. He said, that'll make sure they take it out.
That's right. He was a good
We ought to get some professional from the folks here, shouldn't we? I mean,
Well, I got one more. About going back to get your master's degree in the 90s and to do the writing on the women writers, composers. What prompted that to go back to school?
and this is referring to the fact that I went back to school in 94 and graduated in 96 with a master's in American Studies at Columbia. And the reason I did it is because I had always wanted to. And I knew about the American Studies program, which I think was originated at Yale, and Columbia picked it up, and other schools now have a degree. I wanted to do it, and I had the time, and my wife and I were walking on a kind of a rainy road in Duluth, Minnesota, because I was still in New York and she was at the university. We're walking along, and I'm saying, I would like to do this, and it's April something, 15th, and she said, well, the deadline to submit your application and your essay is tomorrow. So she said, let's go, and you do it.
Hit the books, baby.
And we went back, and I did it, and filed, and they accepted me, and I had two wonderful years. And then I did a paper on Perry Jacobs Bond, composer of I Love You Truly, and The End of a Perfect Day. And I got to tell you, someday there will be a musical and a major motion picture about this woman. I did a lot of research because I was doing a master's degree at Columbia. I was so interested that then 2 years later, I started writing a novelized biography of Perry Jacobs Bond. A couple of the remarkable things about this woman, among many. She was born during the Civil War in Janesville, Wisconsin. Her daddy was an MD in the military. She grew up in that town, writing songs as early as 4 years old, and she had the gift of immediate memory. She went to hear Blind Tom. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Blind Tom, a very disturbed African-American who could play anything. You'd play fancy impromptu and he'd play it back. She could do the same thing.
No.
She lost that skill, but she kept writing songs. She married, and he died, and she was broke, and she went to Chicago with her little boy and tried to write music, and did write music, and of course the publishers in Chicago was a big music publishing center in those days. Well, we'd like to have you with us, Mrs. Bond, if you'll write us some little children's songs. I mean, we're talking real sexism here, come on. What did she do? She opened her own publishing company.
The hell with you.
Well, I can tell you this, Perry Jacobs Bond, who had two of the most successful money-making hits in the history of popular music, I Love You Truly and The End of a Perfect Day. And she also wrote one of my favorite songs, Just a Weary for You, which I learned when I was in the 7th grade. Perry Jacobs Bond, along with only one other person, owned and published every note and word she ever wrote. The other one is Irving Berlin. Any composer, the Gershwins, anybody else, the publisher owned half. She was the publisher. And she ran her own publishing company in Chicago, and then she moved into LA called the Bond Shop. She did these beautiful sheets. She did the artwork. She was also a painter. She did these beautiful watercolors. She lived until 1946. So she lived 50 years after her second husband died. And the reason I did a novelized biography is because she was a very private person. I think Carrie Jacobs Bond had a most exciting life on many, many levels, including sexual, that she never talked about because they didn't.
She's a liberated woman.
And she didn't about anything. She was a very private woman, and good for her.
Yeah.
So I did a lot of speculating about her life because we knew about her music. I mean, you go to the Library of Congress and there it is. It's all there.
Do you think that prompted you, because you put out that album of the women composers. He was one of the first, by the way, to really get into the women composers of lesser renown, and I thank you for that. Thank you so much.
Well, see, that was 20 years earlier.
Okay.
I did the album called The Ragtime Women from Vanguard in 1977. Because I had the sheet music and I kept seeing all these wonderful women's names. I thought, who are these people?
Yeah.
So we researched them and found them, and I made an album of their music.
Yeah, it's
Come
wonderful.
on, Abe.
Let's do some questions.
Okay, you got to have a microphone if you're going to ask any questions. Here's a man, and
Yeah, you know
mic.
what? You can. I'll just come out and pass
Well, you
around.
gotta have-
How's that? I got it. I can use. I'll come out.
Okay, thank you. Look at getting back to your music. Your composition, One for Amelia, incorporated some very innovative musical ideas for 1964, both harmonically and rhythmically. Was it the first to depart from adherence to the harmonic and rhythmic formats of the ragtime era, as far as you know? And number two, were you consciously seeking to innovate? If so, what inspired you to do so?
That's a good question. And he was referring to a rag that I wrote in 1964 called One for Amelia, which was dedicated to Joseph Lamb's widow. One of the great mistakes I ever made in my life was hanging around some in New York while Joe Lamb was still alive, and I didn't go over to Brooklyn to meet him. But I met the family, and I met Amelia, and I wrote this rag for her. I can answer your question somewhat in this way. And this might be a bit of an oversimplification, but I have always thought for years that the so-called big three of ragtime that we all hear about and read about, and they all played ragtime, were Scott Joplin, James Scott, and Joseph Lamb. And this might be an oversimplification, but I find that Joplin was the most lyrical, melodic. You can sing Joplin. Scott was the most pianistic. It was, you don't sing James Scott. You play him, and he's hard, and he's all in. And Joe Lamb led in harmony. And one of the things that I didn't copy him, but I knew that if you know the Joe Lamb rags, his harmonic progressions and his use of dissonances and resolutions was, I think, one of the things that marks his style. And so therefore I felt like, and remember, I grew up playing jazz. I grew up with extended chords, you know, major ninths and 13ths. And here I'm looking at this music and I think, oh, okay, I can add that major seventh there, because he would have. So I think, in a way, that's an answer to your question. That I wasn't trying to copy.
So it is an innovation.
Yeah.
It is innovation.
So what else?
I'll walk around.
How did you get to the point of improvising? Since you, I believe, had a classical background to start with?
The question is, how did I get to improvising, and did I have a classical background? And the answer to the first part is evolutionary, and the second part is no, I did not study classical piano. I took a few piano lessons when I was a kid, yeah. And I took some harmony in high school. But I just learned, because I started playing with pickup bands. And you know, you're playing with a 5-piece band at a social club, you're getting $25, and you better know a bunch of tunes and know the chord progression. And so you learn to read chord symbols, and you learn to do the inversions, and you just, frankly, you pick it up. That's what I did. I learned to improvise because I had to. And as I spoke about my mother, learning to improvise when she wasn't a trained pianist. And because of economics, she taught herself to improvise when she was 37 years old. Now that's hard. When you're a kid, you can do it. Does that help? Yes?
Over the years, who have you worked with who should be better known today, better remembered today?
The question was, who have I worked with that should be better remembered? And of course, if you attended my lecture the other day, which I'll repeat tomorrow, I predict that we will be probably having a Bob Wright Festival sometime 50 years from now. Bob Wright was the remarkably talented guy that showed up playing rag and stride in St. Louis and ended up in Chicago. One of the most, well, I use the word genius very carefully, but he was. And when we met him, and Trigger Titchener was there, and Terry Waldo, several others, at those early, at those early Goldenrod Showboat events, Bob Wright showed up, and the first time I met him, he said, well, I can play all the rags listed, and they all played ragtime. I mean, he didn't brag about it, he just revealed the fact that he had 200 rags under his fingers and could play them. And that lasted for about a year. And again, I go into this in my talk. Bob was from Chicago, went back to Chicago, and spent a year studying Maurice Ravel. His first heroes in piano music were Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell, the avant-garde players. He had his 10-year immersion in Waller and Stride and Joplin, and then left it behind. He earned his living, a bare living, as a studio musician in Chicago on piano and on the trombone, upon which he was a virtuoso. And I always give credit to Terry Waldo. Many of you know Terry. And Terry was his friend and mentor, not mentor, he was his supporter for many years. And Bob had a difficult life health-wise, and he was one of the first, and forgive me because I go into this in great detail tomorrow, he was one of the very first of the people that I knew, and people in the music business or the broadcasting business, who immediately went to synthesizers and electronic keyboards. And his legacy to us, which according to Terry amounts to as many as 1,000 pieces of music, are synthesizers and electronic keyboards. And he started on them when they were very primitive. And we're talking about technology. I, for one, will stand here with this audience and say that 50 years from now, we won't be playing the piano. Sorry. I don't know what we'll be playing. We'll be doing something, and I think we might very well have a Bob Wright festival.
I don't know, that makes me very sad, Max. To dovetail off of that question, except the reverse, I want you to tell me about a gig from hell. Somebody you worked with, I want you to out somebody that you worked with where it was a gig from hell. It was just either the energy was wrong or something. I want you to open it up and out somebody as a really awful, awful person. Because we have gigs from hell all the time.
You notice I'm
And
speechless.
we talk about them all the time.
Hey, no, I'll tell you one.
The reason why I say that is because when I interviewed Hank Jones, I could not get, and Hank Jones worked with Benny Goodman, who was a novel asshole. Benny Goodman, Count Basie, Duke Ellington, all, he would not say a bad word about anybody. He was such a gentleman.
Well,
And you are such a gentleman.
Hank Jones was.
But I want to hear.
Hank Jones was the definitive of the word gentleman.
He was.
Plus, Plus, by the way, I've followed his work, and I have a lot of, he did a couple of those house concerts that you had, where he just sits and plays the piano. You want to follow this man harmonically? Try. I can follow Teddy Wilson. I can follow a lot of piano. I can't follow Hank all the way. What he does. Anyway, gigs from hell. The first thing I have to say is that I have been very unfortunate in this business, working with people like Arthur Godfrey. I toured for a couple of years with a group that worked with Dinah Shore, one of the great, great ladies of our business, and a great talent, and the most generous-hearted person. So, am I going to mock somebody? No. I'll tell you a gig that I remember for being not a bunch of bad people, but a strange situation, and it happened in San Francisco.
But of course.
I'll bet you remember the Boarding House.
Oh, yeah.
Remember
One of my favorite Steve Martin albums comes from the Boarding House.
The Boarding House was a rock and roll club. Now here's how you tell a rock and roll club. The walls are painted black. Right? And it's dirty. There's stuff on the floor. Right? The Boarding House. The guy's name was Allen. That was his last name. I go in there for a 2-week engagement with my show. I've got a stage manager with me. They have a platform, and it's not a theater, but it's a platform. They had a terrible piano, so we rented a grand piano. My agent at that time, and I'll bet you remember Steve Godfrey.
Doesn't
You know
ring a
Steve?
bell, no.
He had a radio program. He did reviews for a long time, long dead now. But he was an agent, and just a terrific guy. Matter of fact, Steve Godfrey was the guy who was responsible for putting together the Preservation Hall Jazz Band and booked them forever. Anyway, Steve was my agent in San Francisco. He got me this job at the Boarding House. I go in there, and it's not going to be easy. I can tell that right away. I can see that the place is going under. I'm in there for 2 weeks, and on closing night, and I was in there a pretty good fee. No money.
Uh-oh.
I called Godfrey. He says, I'll be right over. He comes over. I got a stage manager with me. We have a rental car. He says, park here and leave the engine running.
Did he have a gun?
He might have. Steve was a big guy, and he took no prisoners. He was in there for about a half an hour, and he came out with a grocery bag full of 5s, 10s, and 20s. He said, let's move. We went back to the hotel, counted the money, and it was exactly right. He took his 10% and left, and we flew out the next morning.
Great.
That's my bad story.
That's a good story.
Yeah, it was not a bad guy, though. I think this gentleman that owned it, kind of...
It was just going under.
He was going under, and I happened to catch the end of the story. Anyway.
Yeah. How much time do we have, Mert? Hello?
18 minutes.
Oh, 18 minutes. Okay.
Sure.
5 minutes.
No, not 18 minutes. 5 minutes. We have
All right.
5 minutes. What am I listening to you?
Is there one piece of music, whether ragtime or any other piece, that's been under your fingers more or less from the very beginning? And the second question is, with that piece, has its meaning changed, or how has its personal meaning evolved as your life experiences have influenced your playing and your perception of that music?
You mean my personal approach or performance of ragtime, or?
Well, if there's a piece that maybe even when you're at home, you've been playing it for years and years, maybe a favorite piece, but maybe
A comfort tune.
a comfort
Your
tune.
comfort.
Oh, well, the thing is, I played the rags, yes, but when I was a kid, and I finally began to understand improvisation and stuff, I didn't sit around on our upright piano. We had a nice one at home. I wasn't playing the rags. I'm sorry. I was trying to learn the pop tunes. I was still playing the Maple Leaf for my girlfriend, if she'd accept me. Come back, I love you. But I did not have a big pile of ragtime music. Oh, just a few of those things. I had one of those wonderful John Stark compilations. One of those folders that John Stark, and it had Easy Winners in it, and it had not just Joplin, it had Hilarity Rag by James Scott, and it had a couple, and I woodshedded those. But I didn't try to conquer the really difficult ragtime piano styles. That's something else. And you hear the people that have conquered it. I got around pretty good, but I was never, ever as virtuosic as the people that you hear daily in this festival. I struggled, and when I got into ragtime, one of the reasons that I used it was because I found myself inside of a show business matrix that demanded that I use that kind of music, but also use other tools of the theater, including comedy and song and props and lights and so
You're a vaudeville guy.
Well, but in other words, let me put it this way, folks, and I think this might answer you. I did not earn my living playing the piano, much less playing ragtime piano. I love ragtime piano. I know the history. I was a very close friend of Rudy Blesh, and that was one of the things that opened my eyes.
Yeah.
But I guess we're through, huh?
Max Morrell. You can hear him tomorrow, too. You'll do it tomorrow.
Thank you.